Another video on Earth Science. This is Norris Teaches Science, another Earth Science Edition video with me, Mr. Norris, and today we're going to talk about plate boundaries. So by the end of the video, you should be able to say, I can explain what happens when two plates meet. So, what causes plate movement? It's one of the points of the plate tectonic theory that makes it different from the continental drift theory. But it's all about convective flows or the circulation of magma. So in the mantle, hot magma will rise to the surface. As it rises, it cools and it hits the lithosphere and it just stretches along until it cools back down and then comes back around to get reheated. And so what we call this is a push-pull of the plate. It's pushing or it's pulling the plate along by the convective flows in the mantle. So the driving force for all plate movement is heat. Now, plate boundaries. This is when plates interact with each other. And there's three main types of plate boundaries: divergent, convergent, and transform fault. In class, I usually teach a motion. I take my two fists and I pound them together for a convergent. Then I pull them apart for divergent, and then I take both hands and slide them past each other for transform fault. And you'll understand what these movements mean when we get into the plate boundary movements. But some general activities that can happen at plate boundaries: earthquakes, volcanoes, mountains, and seafloor spreading. So the first type of plate boundary movement we're going to talk about is the divergent plate boundaries. This is when you have your fists together and you pull them apart, because in divergent plate boundaries, two plates are moved up away from each other or moving apart. We also call this spreading centers. And when this happens, new lithosphere is created or new crust is created. You can kind of see the process happening up here. You have this thing called a rift valley forms in the middle of a continent, right where the divergent plate boundary is. And then you can have basically it fills with water at some point and you start to get a little sea to the ocean. Now, divergent boundary features. One is ocean ridges, where this is two ocean plates needed. It's underwater mountain chain. One of the biggest ones is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where two plates are moving away from each other. You can have rift valleys. This is the same process, but this happens on a continent. It has a valley with a lava flow. Don't quote me on it. I think there's one in Africa or near the African plate. And then seafloor spreading, that's when two ocean plates move apart, new crust is being created. You can kind of see this right here in this video with the Rift Valley. Convergent plate boundaries is when you take your two fists and slam them into each other. This is when two plates move towards each other, and the feature depends on what plates are interacting. But one thing that does happen here is crust is destroyed, or lithosphere is destroyed at convergent plate boundaries. Now, if it's an oceanic, continental, convergent boundary, this is where one of the plate is oceanic, one of them is continental. The oceanic plate will go beneath the continental plate. Some features we get subduction zones, we get trenches like the Mariana Trench, and you get continental volcanic arches. What happens is the oceanic plate goes underneath, it melts right here, that magma rises to the surface, forms some volcanic mountains in a chain, and the biggest known one is the Andes. Continental convergent boundaries is when two continental plates come together. They collide. Either one goes underneath or they just start colliding and destroying into each other. Mountains form a lot of times during these processes, like the Appalachians, the Himalayas, and the Alps. Mount Everest is a mountain that's formed by two continental convergent boundaries colliding. And then you have two oceanic plates colliding or converging. One plate does go beneath the other. It does form volcanic island arches, kind of like the Continental Island Arch. The one that goes underneath starts melting, the magma comes up, and you get a volcanic. The Aleutian Islands would be an example of the oceanic convergent boundary. Transform fault plate boundary. This is when two plates grind past each other. This was the two hands sliding past each other. You can kind of hear it with the noise I'm making because that's how I remember these motions. One thing is there's no production and there's no destruction of the lithosphere or the crust at these points. Some features are earthquakes. Earthquakes do happen at transform fault boundaries. San Francisco is in California. You think about that area, they get a lot of earthquakes. They're at a transform fault boundary. And this is a little bit about plate boundaries. We're going to see about earthquakes and volcanoes a little bit more in the coming videos, a little bit more about them, but I hope you learned something today. And this is Mr. Norris, and he's signing out of this plate boundary video.